Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my detailed image quality breakdown from the Sigma 70mm F2.8. This is a macro lens, and it is from their ART series, the first macro lens in the ART series. Now, as I detailed on my first look episode, this is not necessarily a conventional lens, and I would recommend that you spend a little bit of time with that episode because it may help to shape the perceptions that you bring into this current episode. As we're going to see in this episode today, when it comes to the optical performance from this lens, it really is fantastic on most all metrics. However, there are a few quirks in operation that may or may not suit your shooting style. And so spend a little time with that episode. It's about 13 minutes long or so, and get a little more familiar with the actual design of this lens. And then I would encourage you to come back and jump into the image quality to see whether or not this is the lens for you. But in today's episode, I'm going to do a comparison. Since I'm reviewing here in a Canon mount, Canon EF mount, I am doing a comparison to a Canon EF mount lens. And I recognize that the recently reviewed Voigtlander 65mm f2 lens is closer to this lens in terms of focal length. However, I would like to reserve that comparison for if and when, and I do plan at some point to get it in, and Sony FE version of this lens. For one thing, because of some of the questions that I raised in the previous episode regarding adapting this onto with the Sigma MC11. And so for the Canon comparison, I have elected to use the Canon macro lens that's in my own kit, which is a 100mm f2.8 LIS macro lens. It's an excellent lens. Of course, it occupies a higher price point, though in street price, a lot of times, you have an opportunity to get that lens because it's been on the market for a while at a discounted price to where it's not as big a difference as you might think, particularly if you're willing to consider a used lens, for example. And so I think it's a good comparison point, even though it's 100mm versus 70mm. I've tried to equalize that out as much as possible by moving in or out in the comparisons. So let's jump into those comparisons as well as just a detailed breakdown of the image quality itself. So we're going to start by a comparison of resolution. So the macro lens that I have on hand that I own personally that is as close a comparison as that I really have is a Canon's own 100mm f2.8 L Macro IS. And so that lens certainly has some other advantages. For example, if you're looking at the build quality and autofocus, and of course it has an image stabilizer. But in this case, we're really looking purely at the image quality. And so looking here in the center of the frame, I would say that it's pretty easy to see that the Sigma is at the very least every bit as good and possibly just slightly higher levels of contrast there, but delivering a pretty similar type performance. Looking off the edge of the frame, both of these lenses really stay sharp right out to the edge of the frame, but I would say if we're looking at this versus this, that the Sigma is definitely the winner. And you can see, for example, in these kind of grout areas, that contrast is holding up towards a very, very extreme edge of the frame, essentially perfectly. And so I would say even from corner to corner, even if you move up into the very extreme corner, other than vignette impacting the image somewhat, you essentially have perfect image quality all the way across the frame, even at f2.8. Now with both lenses stopped down to f4, what I am seeing here is it continues to be, obviously a strong performance from both lenses, but I do think that the Sigma has the absolute advantage in terms of the micro contrast there and just rendering a little bit sharper and a little more detail than what the Canon is. And moving out to the edge of the frame, it was already basically perfect at f2.8, and so unsurprisingly at f4. It looks even better, and mostly looks better because we've got a considerable amount of vignette lift by comparison to the f2.8. The Canon image is looking stronger here now also, and more competitive out to the very edge of the frame, though I'm still going to give the micro contrast win to the Sigma lens. Now at f5.6, as you might expect, both of them continue to look, basically exceptionally perfect. And so a really, really strong resolution performance out of the Sigma lens. Now looking at the image globally, what you're going to see is that there is basically no detectable levels of distortion when it, in any kind of practical way. I'm seeing very, very straight lines, good geometry, and so that's certainly a plus. We'll take a look at how vignette lifts, because clearly wide open, we've got a fairly significant amount of vignette, F2.8. So moving on to F4, you see a significant brightness across a pretty good portion of the frame. I'm just going to toggle back and forth here. So you can see from about this point outward, going to F4 shows a significant vignette lift. Moving on to F5.6, and you see a more mild out towards the edge of the frame. And then finally at F8, it is a near imperceptible amount of difference between F5.6 and F8. Now, the advantage of such fantastic resolution right out of the box means that even at a landscape type focal distance here, and this is the Fairmont Tremblant in Mont Tremblant, Quebec. And so shooting down here, even with the sun in the frame, but if we look down at a pixel level, I mean, could you ask for more than that? I mean, this is on a 30 megapixel Canon 5D Mark IV, and you can see, really right off to the edge of the frame. I mean, everything looks great. I mean, there's no chromatic aberration on the, shiny edges of the building. You can see that the detail is perfect. I mean, and right off here to the edge of the frame, other than the impact of vignette. I mean, look at right down here, resolution still looks fantastic. There's an amazing amount of detail across the image. So, I mean, Sigma definitely delivered when it comes to image quality. And of course, here, as you can see, we've got the impact of the sun right here in the frame. And, as I look throughout the image itself, I am seeing very, very little impact from flare or ghosting. This is about the extent of what I'm seeing. I believe right here there is the tiniest little ghost pattern, but I mean, that's basically it. That's pretty fantastic. Now here's another wide open shot. I just wanted to show you kind of a different type of look. And so here we've got a fairly busy background here, but we've got a subject here, just someone kind of doing a little reading. But you can see even at a wide open, and I wanted trying to see even at a fair distance, maybe 50 or 60 feet, 20 meters from the subject, I was able to get a nice looking amount of subject isolation, a very clear plane of focus there, and then a nicely defocused background. So optically, that's strong right there. Now here is a stopping down to smaller apertures to try to get expand the depth of field. And as you can see, even though there's some haze in the distance, due to the lighting effects here and just the amount of separation to the difference. I mean, if you look down at these hikers on these trails, just everywhere that you look in the image frame, there is beautiful amounts of very crisp detail. And so, I mean, it's just optically, it's a fantastic lens, no question about it. Here's a scene that's full of activity, lots of people, and this 70mm focal length is, I think, a fairly flexible one. It gives you a lot of options on framing things without framing them too tightly. And once again, as you can see, just beautiful color rendition, great contrast, great detail everywhere. And so, again, it's a very, very flexible optical instrument. So I wanted to use this as an illustration for chromatic aberrations. And so, of course, this is rendered basically monochromatic by the scene and the subject here. And so as we can see, however, even on these these are areas where, just because of the nature of longitudinal chromatic aberration, when you've got a defocused foreground and a defocused background, you're often going to see, usually it is the purple fringing and the green fringing on either side of the plane of focus. We've got, really crisp contrast here, very, very strong detail rendering. And so, I mean, this is a lens that really does perform very little aberration to point to. And now here we have the standard torture test that during the, the milder months of the year I'm able to do. And I like this, it's a fairly repeatable type image with grass, or in my case, weeds here in the foreground. It gives you a look at the bokeh circles nice and clearly in terms of both the geometric deformation, which, as you can see, you've got the football / lemons along the edge of the frame, which is pretty standard stuff when it comes to most lenses that I use wide open. You do have some geometric deformation along the edges of the frame. That's kind of the nature of the beast. Looking at the bokeh circles themselves, they to me look a lot like Sigma bokeh circles. There's some general busyness inside, not so much concentric rings, just some kind of busyness inside. But as you can see in the main soft ones there, you're not really seeing any kind of like onion type quality, but you are seeing just some general busyness. And anyway, overall that's not a bad performance. And of course, kind of germane to what we're looking at right here, chromatic aberrations in any of these really high contrast areas just aren't showing up. And so it's a pretty strong performance. I think the biggest thing here is that if you don't like geometric deformation, it's basically you're stopping the lens down, and as you stop it down, your bokeh circles here are not as long, or not as big, I should say, but they also will start to even out in terms of the circular shape across the frame. Going back to comparisons for a moment, Canon on the right, Sigma on the left, I think you're going to find that consistently the Sigma is delivering higher levels of contrast, both on a global level and then micro contrast here at a pixel level. It's delivering, I think a higher resolution. There's less any kind of veiling. The sharpness and resolution is a little bit higher as a result. If you look at the images globally, however, that contrast works great on the subject. It's less great on the background. Now understand also, of course, that while I've tried to move closer to match the framing as much as possible, the Canon, of course, has 30 extra millimeters that is going to cause a little bit more of a compression of the background. And so, but even trying to get them fairly close, and they're not identical, but they're within a fairly close margin of error, what you're finding here is that the background is just basically busier from the Sigma lens. And that's the challenge sometimes when you increase resolution and contrast, is to then continue to deliver a softer background rendering. And so as you can see, the Canon has done a better job of that with the bokeh and just kind of the general rendering from the lenses. Now here's a second image where I have compared the two, and I've tried to, with the framing, moving the Sigma in a little bit until the magnification is roughly similar between the two. And I think you can see as we zoom in at a pixel level that that's the case. I mean, it's occupying basically the same amount of the frame. So looking at this once again, I mean, I don't think that there's any doubt that the Sigma is delivering the higher levels of contrast here. You can just see a bigger difference between the the bright areas and the dark areas. So again, contrast favors Sigma. However, the overall bokeh rendering, it kind of favors, I would say, the Canon lens. It's just softer, a little less. Here with the Sigma, you're seeing some hard edges. And so in the absolute kind of rendering sense, you're going to look at these and either you're going to favor the contrast and the sharpness of the Sigma, or you're going to favor the overall rendering. I'm mostly showing them, and so you can choose a priority for yourself. And so not that the Sigma is bad in terms of the rendering in the autofocus areas, but the Canon is certainly a little bit softer. Now we have basically already determined that the Sigma is essentially definitely at an infinity distance or portrait distance is pretty much perfect wide open. And so, that continues to be our case here at macro type distances. I mean, detail is fantastic here. And so you're able to treat stopping the lens down. So example, here we go to F4, you could see the vignette lift. You can see that our depth of field has increased a little bit, but the raw resolution is fairly similar. We'll take it a step further. Here's F5.6, and so you're going to find at macro distances your background is still nice and soft, defocused here. Bokeh is good, and so but what you're going to see here is you're just increasing your depth of field. And at macro distances, you really do need to stop lenses down because your depth of field becomes so shallow as to be almost unusable in a lot of cases. Here's another example at macro type distances, and so we'll take a close look here. You can see great detail and contrast, a beautiful amount of detail, but then as you step back, and this is right out of camera, I have not edited this in any way, shape, or form. Beautiful color rendition, very at macro distances, your defocused area is beautifully soft, melts away very nicely, and of course you have a beautiful end result. Here's another image at close macro type distances. This is wildflowers / weeds. And so it's not much of a distance to other defocused elements, but a great combination of sharpness and color, and then the bokeh rendering. And so very nice there. Here's another example where I think the lens has done a really nice job. What you're seeing is that this little Japanese maple, it's only about 1.5 feet, 2 feet from, this is actually the metal from a window well, from a basement window. And so, obviously not a very attractive background. And so at a macro distance, the amount of, compression of the background means that has melted away, even though that's very hard edges, that has melted away quite nicely. And of course, looking at our subject, beautiful detail and contrast, color rendition, it does good macro things just like you would want. So as you can see, when it comes to the actual image quality performance from this lens, there is a lot to appreciate. This is, I noted in the first episode that Sigma stated in their press release that they elected to go away from an internally focusing lens to try to optimize really for overall image quality. And so a byproduct of that is that they seem to kind of eschew focus speed and internal focus in favor of just focusing on having as much image quality as possible. And so as we can see across the board, image quality really is excellent. This is a very strong performing lens, very strong contrast, excellent detail and resolution, and really corner to corner excellent resolution from F2.8 on. So the only real defects that I could point to is that there certainly is some vignette at wider apertures. A lot of that clears up by f4, however, and so it doesn't stay a factor for all that long. The other thing is that I might point to is the bokeh quality is it's good at macro levels. Some of those kind of medium transition distances, it's not as smooth as we saw as the Canon 100mm F2.8L, which a lot of times macro lenses do have good bokeh quality, and so I think that in this case the it's not as great as what I've seen. Another lens, of course, to consider when it comes to image quality that I found was also a very strong performer is the Tamron 90mm F2.8, particularly their, the newest SP version of that lens. It really is also a very strong lens to consider. But in pure optical sense, Sigma really has nailed this lens. It certainly belongs in the ART series in terms of its optical performance. I'm Dustin Abbott, and stay tuned for my kind of wrapping up of all of this in my final review that will be coming shortly, and I'll detail all the various pieces that I've covered so far, kind of recap those, but then also jump into my observations as a real photographer and who I think this lens is for. In the meantime, you can check out the image gallery in the description down below and see more images. That's always a great way to get a sense of whether or not a lens is for you or not. And then also you can find buying links there. This is a very reasonably priced lens. And you can also find all the typical links for following me on social media, signing up for my newsletter, or becoming a patron. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.